Gentlemen, we've talked an awful lot on our air recently about socialism versus capitalism, defending capitalism, all of the different political pressures that are kind of being brought as we get into another election year. And I thought maybe we could talk about that this morning. What do you think about the attacks that we've seen to this point on capitalism?
Hello, everybody. This is Peter Joseph, and welcome to the first installment of Yelling at the Wind, a sub-series of my Culture in Decline project designed to help with public debate on critical social issues, aside, of course, from highlighting the fact that we live in a complete train wreck of a civilization getting worse every single day. Over the past 15 years, I've sporadically made response videos to ongoing lunacy out there, and decided for the sake of my Patreon supporters, I would formalize this as a project. Since my output has been low recently with my Revolution Now podcast, writings, and larger film and developmental projects, Yelling at the Wind allows me to have a less formal approach, being more prolific while also taking on contemporary events. If you are a Patreon subscriber and you would like to recommend something, please contact me through the Culture in Decline web series website. Introductions aside, let's jump in. Today we're going to be addressing these three gentlemen as they attempt to defend capitalism, allowing us to see things through the lens of some of the richest men in the world. And let me first say, amusingly, that CNBC couldn't have done a better job of fostering a cliché. Nothing like three rich old white men sitting awkwardly together defending an economic system that indeed has its foundations in human slavery. Aside, of course, from the absurdity of the broadcast spectacle throwing a breaking news title on the segment, breaking news, rich old white men defend capitalism, let's immediately recognize the fallacy of the framework. I often wonder what public discourse on economics would be today if the false, polarized duality of capitalism versus socialism didn't make it into the lexicon of economic discourse. While we can understand the rise of historical socialism in practice, by whatever definition, finding different problems in the same way we can find problems with capitalism, this ongoing tendency to assume that anything that isn't capitalism must be socialism is a tremendous and tragic intellectual and creative failure. It's like saying if you're not interested in apples, then bananas are the only other option. The political use of this false duality has been incredibly powerful. So powerful, in fact, that there are now people wandering the planet that actually call themselves socialists in all of its grand vagary, hoodwinked by what is really an ecosystem of pro-capitalist propaganda. The cultural climate today is as it was 70 years ago with the rise of McCarthyism and the tremendous campaign against the Soviet Union. And since then, like clockwork, the moment anyone gets concerned about the exceptional waste and inhumanity of a scarcity-based capitalist economy, legions of people jump up like automaton drones and say, "But hey, wait a minute, does that mean you want central planning and socialism? Ooh!" You see, true debate about efficiency and the value of an economic system has nothing to do with anything but an analysis of system integrity in and of itself. It's about efficiency. It's about sustainability and quantifiable analysis around such issues. Wasting time talking about other historical patterns only gives us information about problems related to those particular patterns in and of themselves. The ongoing false duality of capitalism versus socialism is nothing more than a limit of debate that has been psychologically established to make sure people remain confused about possibilities, acquiescing to a social system that ultimately favors an elite minority at the expense of the majority, and, of course, at the expense of the environment, that can only be seen as an inventory by the system to exploit through infinite economic growth.
It isn't that capitalism is perfect, but if you look at what was here in 1776 and look at what is here now, this country has done an incredible job in terms of the deployment of resources and human ingenuity.
Well, here we have Warren Buffett, the sixth richest man in the world, who literally made all of his money through gambling. That's all investment is, gambling, period. Warren Buffett has created nothing, and he contributes nothing to society on any tangible level. As far as his 1776 implication, he's referring, of course, to the establishment of the United States, but he could also be referring to the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And I will say that if Adam Smith was alive today, to see someone like Warren Buffett in the financial gambling success that he has, Smith would puke in his soup. Smith was never a fan of vain speculation. He believed in an economy where people actually built and created and contributed, not owned and traded. But more to his completely vague point, what is he even talking about here? Prior to when the United States emerged in 1776, after it stole all the indigenous land? How is comparing what happened long, long ago in a very primitive time to what we have today indicative of the success of capitalism? Without the cotton trade and the exploitation of free labor, the United States would not be the empire it is today. Is that the trajectory of success he's referring to? Even more beyond that, it's an absolute cliche to give this overarching idea that markets are the origin point of the standard of living increase that we've seen, when in reality, as per any economy, it's really science and technology. In fact, patterns of capitalism existed long before 1776, and it was the breaking of the Malthusian trap upon the Industrial Revolution that set new levels of efficiency in motion. So if you're going to objectively describe what creates material advancement in any society, markets are a completely secondary aspect, as it's simply an infrastructure. It's like saying the highway system is the reason society is as strong as it is because it allows people to get into their cars and go to their jobs. And yet there are many different kinds of transportation infrastructure, many of which perhaps could make it even more efficient, using this analogy. So all of this is to say that Mr. Buffett's observation that, hey, a couple hundred years ago we had horse and buggies and now we have airplanes and trains, and that must mean capitalism works, is a completely empty statement, a fallacy of singular causality to what is a very complex socioeconomic and scientific technological development over time, the roots of which cannot be attributed to just market behavior.
Now, does that mean that every decision should be made simply by open market determinants? No, there's a need for regulation, obviously, and there are things that have long-term costs and might not get built in.
At the core of market mythology is the idea of self-regulation, also known as general equilibrium theory, or even Adam Smith's invisible hand. And for many decades, it's become academically clear that there is no equilibrium to be found in market dynamics, and to whatever degree markets self-regulate is miserable at best. In stark contradiction to the theory of laissez-faire, if balance is going to emerge in this system, it's proportional to intelligent intervention. In the words of Stafford Beer, a viable system needs no controls or regulation. It is a fundamental determining qualification when you look at any system behavior. The more regulation required, the more unviable a system becomes. And at some point, the lack of viability of a system can completely contradict assumptions about what that system even does, which is exactly the case with market economics. It's difficult to overstate the severity of the necessity of intervention in this system, because people like Buffett and other capitalist apologists have a tendency to downplay this reality because it infringes on the supposed integrity of the system. They're not ignorant enough to go full orthodox libertarian and say that no intervention should exist. Instead, they acquiesce to a vague general idea of intervention being needed, still assuming, though, the all-seeing wisdom of the market god in its self-regulatory superiority. While some degree of price consensus can be found in the ebb and flow between supply and demand, the relevance of this when compared to the empirical instability of the system as a whole, which always, as a matter of function, moves toward increased economic and wealth inequality, keeping the rich rich and the poor poor, along with always inherently moving toward environmental destruction, because the system is endogenously based on infinite economic growth and requires perpetual consumption, with no ability to account for negative market externalities. In fact, since I just used that phrase, you ever wondered why we call them market externalities, externalized costs? Whoever came up with that line was intuitively brilliant because that is precisely the problem. It's indicative of a model that is completely blind in its operation. Hence, the emphasis on required regulation is the most important economic issue to discuss and consider if you want to preserve this kind of toxic system. If you don't want to continue destroying the ecosystem, which we're still doing, and you don't want to create class instability through wealth and income inequality where violent revolutions occur or tens of millions of people die every single year because of the public health effects of socioeconomic inequality, you have to regulate like a motherfucker.
It's absolutely a miracle, and what all three of us have seen during our lifetime. And if you compare that with any centralized planned economy, I think we win hands down.
Once again, another false duality, binary propaganda phrase that gives no information about anything when considering the integrity, system-level integrity of market capitalism itself. If the basis of decision-making in the world today was simply thinking in terms of comparison as opposed to analyzing what's actually going on, we would all have perished long ago. The economic myth that anything that doesn't utilize market dynamics can only be a centrally planned economy and hence some kind of top-down inefficient bureaucracy is just another red herring fallacy argument born from the information war against the former Soviet Union by the United States working to maintain its geopolitical dominance. We live today in an age of profoundly powerful, virtually instantaneous electronic networks. Decentralization, as opposed to hierarchy, along with various other network-oriented designs, have prevailed in many different arenas, revealing ways to organize that have nothing to do with top-down hierarchy and power imbalances as such.
Socialism used to mean that the state controlled the means of production, and a lot of people who are promoting socialism actually aren't using that classic definition. So what we're going to have is capitalism with some level of taxation. Most people really aren't arguing against capitalism. There may be a few, but most people are just saying that the taxes should change.
All right, so here we have Bill Gates, who along with Steve Jobs stole the concept of a graphic interface personal computer from Xerox, and quite brazenly so. Yes, we could talk about standing on the shoulders of giants in the serial unfolding of information and development out there, but remember, when it comes to the market economy, it's all deceitful competitive warfare. And if you think warfare has any place in society on any level, expecting sustainable results, just take a look at the world around you right now. The human condition is complex, and competitive behaviors are certainly part of the balance of survival of any species. But when you premise an entire society artificially on competition, it limits collaborative options and you get this spiraling spectrum of disorder that can only lead toward destruction, as advanced warfare technologies and deep earthly scarcities emerge because of the ongoing negligence of the capitalist economy itself. We have built an economy that is foundationally competitive, and then we're surprised that it's riddled with corruption and disorder. It's not just human-to-human competition. The entire economic premise creates agents that are also at war with our very habitat, as we are seeing right now, with constant business pushback against anything trying to regulate toward environmental balance, reduce biodiversity loss, resource overshoot, pollution, and so on. And the sad thing is the business community is probably going to win that battle at the expense of all of us. So, back to Mr. Gates, he tries to set the record straight by increasing the vagueness of what socialism means, referring to the application of taxation as some pivotal element of the debate in his own mind. Yes, taxation and redistribution of income and wealth is precisely what has happened and what continues to be required if we expect any equity at all to emerge between people on this planet. However, it's not all-encompassing or symbolic, it's just a cliché talking point. As far as the evolution of this system, let's point out that the rise of neoliberalism and supply-side economics, most notably born from the Reagan-Thatcher era, decided that taxing rich people and corporations was a bad idea because they are the coveted job creators. It's a predictable, elitist economic evolution, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to decode the idea, realizing it's all about class warfare. It's very convenient to sit back and say we shouldn't tax the rich business owners because they create jobs, when the only real effect of this so-called economic idea is to make sure the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. And you don't need a formal conspiracy for that to occur, because these are converging interests on the part of the ownership class. They intuitively understand the near zero-sum game markets create, and they act competitively against the impecunious masses as a form of intuition. Now, since Bill attempted to explain the spectrum of perceived socialism, let's clarify on his behalf. When most people today refer to socialism, they're referring to state intervention where a population receives something that didn't go through market channels, at least not directly across the board, such as Social Security, welfare, and so on. It's also considered socialistic in this way if the state controls an industry, such as through nationalization, or if government decides to make something free in the public arena, such as, say, transportation. If the United States decided to make all the train systems, for example, free for public use, the conservative minds would, of course, call that an evil socialist intervention. That noted, that's actually not what socialism means in its core definition, which again enters into vague territory because all we're really dealing with is a kind of principle. A principle dealing with democratic control of the means of production. Now notice I said democratic control as opposed to state control. Public control as opposed to elitist control. Because the idea of the state has taken on such an ominous sensibility that people can no longer separate the idea that maybe there's a way to have public consensus on issues economically that doesn't have the problems that we commonly associate, or I should say, libertarian pro-market people commonly associate to state control, which is almost universally equated to some kind of central planning tyranny. It's really interesting when you think about conservative mindsets in the political sphere, because many of them don't even believe in their position. They don't even believe the state should have any power. That's why there are always self-regulation-seeking market enthusiasts that want to remove, say, big government. Remember that one from the Reagan era? In fact, as a force of social manipulation, it's really quite incredible when you think about it. So here you have an elite capitalist ownership class that's trying to figure out a way to preserve the power structure that they know and love. And then they realize that there's some kind of design planning concepts being developed in some other country that they want to compete against. And then they associate that to regulation and any kind of management. And then they associate the management to democracy and then to state power. So really, the attack isn't against the state. The attack is against democracy itself, by which business, of course, has always had a huge problem with because it has no structural recognition of it. To say that state power is inevitably corrupt is to say that democracy is inevitably corrupt. And once again, what's the problem with all of this? It's all completely vague. It's like saying that anything that isn't markets must be draconian central planning, anything that isn't capitalist must be socialistic and tyrannical, and saying that democracy itself will inevitably lead to some kind of state elitist institution that is invariably corrupt, therefore we can't allow them to regulate the coveted market economy at all because they're just going to be corrupt with it, right? It's very important to understand these myopic limits of debate because they're everywhere. I mean, seriously, again, how many times have you heard someone complain about what's happening in society with inequity, scarcity, pollution, unemployment, and so on, and someone else inevitably chimes in and says, well, that's just because the state has messed up the self-regulation through its petty, tyrannical interference and regulation. Free the market god, deregulate, and privatize. I will simply conclude this point by saying that economic democracy is what we should all be striving for, increasing equity and environmental sustainability. How that looks is a different conversation. It most certainly isn't going to look like the state corrupt powers that we have today within the capitalist economy, because everyone is so terrified of losing their socioeconomic power positions that inevitably they gravitate towards corruption, because it's a competitive system. Competition will always move toward desperation and corruption, especially when you have an economic order that's premised entirely upon the exploitation and preservation of scarcity.
Now, there is some muddy areas. When you start to say there shouldn't be any billionaires, that you have some cap on wealth or something like that, that goes beyond what I think, and you could say I'm self-interested, but...
Here we go. And I have to admit, it's when I saw this particular statement, I realized I had to make a commentary. Because if you listen carefully, even Bill Gates doesn't really believe what he's trying to indicate. Why is it so many people out there today have come to the intuitive conclusion that billionaires simply shouldn't exist, and any economic system that creates them must be operationally deranged? Well, first, you would have to be a sociopath to accept the idea that a person flying a $5 million private jet around the world, eating caviar and living in 50-room mansions, while another person, another human being, digs in a dumpster every night for food, living in a cardboard box, is just normal. So that's one level, but we're going to put the general moral issue aside and focus on something quantitative here. What's implied by people like Bill Gates, who think that there should be no wealth cap, is a perception of infinite growth, infinite wealth, and a habitat with infinite resources. Markets are a near zero-sum game, as I have written about and talked about at great length. If you don't understand how a competitive, scarcity-based economy is ultimately a zero-sum game, just think about the fact that we live on a finite planet with finite resources, right? Imagine an island of 100 people. It could be 1,000 people, it could be 1 billion people, it could be 8 billion people as we have today. Forget money for a second or any symbology related to value conjured up, and simply think about 1% of that population owning 99% of all the physical resources on the island. Would that be an acceptable economic outcome where, in effect, the vast majority starve to death while a select few have luxury? No, it's not an acceptable economic outcome, and that comes from not a moral standpoint, but a stability standpoint. That understood, let's now incorporate a financial system, money. Money which is created through loans, through banks, and the money supply ebbs and flows because the money supply is not fixed. And as it ebbs and flows, it changes its own value holistically, as we see with things like inflation. It's kind of like having a game of poker, which would be a zero-sum game, but the money in the center, the kitty, is not actually fixed in exact value because there are external forces that are changing that value over time for reasons we're not going to even go into. But if you're familiar with what inflation does, you should understand this very easily. Pure zero-sum games don't have that feature, so near zero-sum is the way we will qualify this. And let me just say that just because it's near zero-sum doesn't really change anything. In the end, while people can debate the theory of monetary value, if it wasn't for the physical world existing, clearly money would have no purpose. Hence, money effectively mirrors the physical world in an extremely sloppy way. Hence, a person with $1 billion in the bank might as well have $1 billion worth of food, hoarding that food from other people. You simply cannot extract income, wealth, and property in a capitalist society without the process of exclusion. You are taking away available resources from others through the act of competition. Trade divides and excludes in a near zero-sum manner. And given this, anyone who thinks that it's somehow morally irrational, I suppose, to have a wealth cap in an economy where the endogenous lack of equilibrium always moves money from the bottom to the top, ensuring a rich minority at the expense of a poor majority, has no idea what they're talking about when they refer to market economics. Just another delusion created by the religion. Infinite growth, infinite wealth, infinite resources. Hey, we can all have $1 billion, $1 trillion, $1 quadrillion in the bank. It doesn't matter. It's just fake money. It doesn't really mirror anything. Actually, it does. It's all finite. Not only should there be no billionaires in any sane economy that wants to preserve social stability, there should be no mass deviation from a general mean when it comes to the distribution of income and wealth overall. Because the larger the deviation automatically translates into systemic deprivation with true human costs.